A man alone in the wilderness and a grizzly bear in pain. What he did next shocked everyone. Imagine walking through the vast, untamed wilderness, the kind of place where nature reigns supreme, where survival depends on instinct and resilience. Now, picture this, a grizzly bear, one of the most powerful creatures in the wild, crying in agony. What would you do? This is the story of Sam, a man who stumbled upon the unimaginable, a massive, wounded grizzly bear sobbing like a child. Every instinct told him to turn back, to run, but something in those sorrowful eyes held him frozen in place. What happened next is something you'll never forget. Stay with us until the very end because this true story will break your heart, challenge everything you think you know about nature, and leave you speechless. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. We bring you inspiring real-life stories of courage and connection that you won't find anywhere else. Now, let's begin. Jack had lived in the mountains his entire life. The vast wilderness of the Yukon was his home, a place where he felt at peace. When he was offered the position of forest ranger, he accepted without hesitation. Every 2 days, he patrolled the area, ensuring that nature remained undisturbed. The winter that year was particularly harsh. Snow blanketed the ground in thick layers, and the air carried a biting chill that cut through even the thickest coats. As Jack made his way through the dense forest, his breath came out in visible puffs, his boots crunching through the frozen terrain. It was an ordinary day, or so he thought, until a sound stopped him in his tracks. A faint, sorrowful whimper echoed through the silence. Jack's heart pounded as he listened carefully. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again, clear, desperate, and close. His instincts kicked in, and he followed the sound cautiously, stepping carefully through the uneven ground covered in snow and ice. As he approached a cluster of bushes, he saw something unusual, a small mound of disturbed snow. He moved closer and gasped. A tiny grizzly cub, half-buried and shivering, struggled to lift its head. Its fur was matted with ice, and its body was covered in deep bite marks. Jack's stomach twisted at the sight. The little bear had clearly been attacked and left for dead. Kneeling beside the cub, Jack hesitated. Grizzlies were dangerous, even at a young age. If the mother was nearby, she would not take kindly to his presence. But as he looked around, there were no tracks other than those of the cub. It was alone. Jack removed his gloves and reached out slowly. The cub flinched but was too weak to resist. Its breathing was shallow, and its tiny body trembled violently in the freezing cold. Without another thought, Jack carefully scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it against his chest. He could feel its frail heartbeat beneath his fingers. "We'll get you warm, little guy," he whispered, pulling his coat tightly around the cub as he began his trek back to the valley. The journey was grueling. The weight of the cub wasn't the problem, it was the terrain. Jack had to maneuver through thick snow, uneven slopes, and bitter winds that stung his face. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he pressed on, determined. The cub let out soft, pitiful whimpers, and each sound pushed Jack forward, fueling his determination. By the time he reached his cabin, his muscles ached, and his fingers were nearly numb. He hurried inside, setting the cub down gently on a pile of old blankets near the fireplace. Kneeling beside it, he examined the injuries more closely. The bite wounds were deep but not fresh. Whatever had attacked this cub had left it to die at least a day ago. Jack grabbed a clean cloth and some warm water, beginning the slow process of cleaning the wounds. The cub whimpered in pain but did not struggle. It was too weak to fight back, too cold and exhausted to resist. Jack worked carefully, whispering soothing words as he wrapped the cub in warmth and safety. As he finally sat back, exhausted but relieved, he watched the tiny creature sleep. It had a long road to recovery, but for now, it was safe. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt something stir deep within him, purpose. Little did he know, this moment would be the beginning of a bond that would change his life forever. Jack spent days ensuring the cub stayed warm, feeding it small amounts of milk infused with honey to provide nutrients. The cub remained weak at first, barely able to move, but Jack noticed slight improvements with each passing day. The once lifeless eyes of the tiny bear started to show a flicker of recognition, its breathing becoming stronger. At night, the cub would cry out softly, likely longing for its mother. Jack would sit beside it, murmuring in a calm voice, letting the cub know it was not alone. As the days stretched into weeks, the cub's strength grew. Jack spent hours researching how to properly care for a bear cub, knowing that each step taken now would be crucial to its survival in the wild. Jack knew he had to build a better space for Boris. He converted a section of his cabin into a secure but comfortable area where Boris could explore and stretch his legs. Soon, the cub started waddling around, sniffing everything in sight. Sometimes stumbling clumsily into Jack's boots. One morning, Jack woke to a surprising sight. Boris was sitting upright, watching him intently. The cub had never done this before. "Well, look at you," Jack murmured. "You're getting stronger, little guy." Over time, Boris became more curious about his surroundings. Jack introduced him to different elements of the wilderness, bringing in small branches, leaves, and even some fresh fish from the nearby river. The cub was hesitant at first, sniffing cautiously before gingerly licking at the fish. It was an instinct that would be essential for Boris's survival later on. As Boris grew, so did his confidence. He followed Jack around the cabin, clumsily attempting to climb furniture, often knocking things over in the process. Jack would sigh in exasperation, but he couldn't help but chuckle at the cub's antics. One day, Jack decided it was time to introduce Boris to the outside world beyond the cabin. He carried the bear to a small clearing, setting him down carefully on the snow-covered ground. At first, Boris hesitated, uncertain of this new environment. But then, with a cautious sniff, he took his first real steps outside. His small paws pressed into the snow, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. Jack watched as Boris grew more comfortable, beginning to playfully bat at a fallen twig, tumbling over himself in excitement. It was a sight that filled Jack's heart with warmth. Despite their growing bond, Jack knew an undeniable truth: this was a wild animal, and despite their deepening connection, Boris would one day have to return to the wilderness. Jack avoided thinking about that moment, focusing instead on each day they had together. Boris followed Jack everywhere, even on his patrols through the forest. He would stumble through the snow, playfully batting at sticks, occasionally getting distracted by birds overhead. Jack found himself smiling more than he had in years. As weeks turned into months, Boris continued to grow. His once frail body was now sturdy and strong, his fur thickened, and his movements became more coordinated. He began to exhibit behaviors that hinted at his future as a full-grown grizzly, digging at the earth, sniffing out hidden scents, and even standing on his hind legs to survey his surroundings. Jack knew he had to start preparing Boris for the life that awaited him beyond the safety of the cabin. He began taking Boris deeper into the forest, showing him where to find food, how to track scents, and how to identify potential dangers. Though Boris still followed Jack like a devoted companion, Jack could sense the change happening, his instincts were sharpening, his wild nature slowly returning. One evening, as they sat near the fire, Jack ran his hand through Boris's thickening fur. "You're not a cub anymore," he said softly. Boris, now almost reaching Jack's waist in size, let out a small huff and rested his head against Jack's knee. It was a bittersweet moment. Jack had saved Boris's life, but he knew that soon he would have to let him go. For now, though, the bond between them remained unbreakable, and Jack cherished every second they had left. Boris had become an inseparable part of Jack's life. The cub had grown from a fragile, helpless creature into a robust, lively bear. Jack had to reinforce parts of the cabin as Boris's strength increased. Furniture toppled over more frequently, and the once small creature now left paw prints nearly as large as Jack's hands. The tiny ball of fur that once clung to his leg for warmth was now an adolescent grizzly, his muscles growing stronger by the day. Jack adapted to Boris's growth, creating a larger pen outside the cabin where the bear could explore and exercise. Boris often spent his mornings playfully rolling in the snow, shaking off the frost from his thickening coat. Jack watched as Boris developed into a skilled forager, digging through the underbrush for roots and insects, occasionally swiping his large paws at tree trunks, testing his growing strength. Jack began taking Boris on longer expeditions into the wilderness, deep into the forest where he would one day live on his own. Each trip was a lesson. Jack taught Boris how to sniff out water sources, track small prey, and recognize the scents of other animals. Boris was a quick learner, his instincts slowly awakening. He became more independent on these journeys, often wandering a little farther ahead but always circling back to Jack, as if seeking reassurance. One afternoon, while trekking through a dense section of the forest, Jack noticed Boris stop suddenly. His ears twitched, and his nose lifted into the air, sniffing something unseen. Then, in an instant, Boris let out a low growl and turned to face the trees. Jack's heart pounded as he followed Boris's gaze. Not far ahead, a full-grown male grizzly emerged from the brush. Jack froze. This was a crucial moment. Boris was no longer a cub, this was the first time he would be confronted with one of his own kind. The larger bear eyed Boris curiously but with a caution that made Jack uneasy. Boris, though still smaller, squared his shoulders and let out a sound Jack had never heard before, a deep, resonant huff that spoke of his growing maturity. For several tense seconds, neither bear moved. Jack stood perfectly still, knowing that intervening could make things worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the older bear snorted and lumbered away, disappearing into the woods. Boris relaxed, shaking the tension from his fur, but Jack could see it in his eyes, something inside Boris had changed. That night, as they sat by the fire, Jack ran a hand through Boris's fur, feeling the thick muscle beneath. "You're not just a cub anymore," he murmured. Boris nudged Jack's shoulder before settling down, but Jack knew the moment was coming, the moment he had been dreading. Boris was no longer a pet, no longer a dependent creature needing Jack's care. He was becoming what he was meant to be, a grizzly. Over the following months, Boris's behavior changed. He spent longer periods exploring alone, returning only after hours in the wilderness. His instincts were taking over. Jack saw it in the way Boris reacted to sounds, the way his body moved with newfound confidence. One crisp autumn morning, Jack woke to find Boris standing at the edge of the clearing, gazing toward the mountains. The moment was bittersweet. Jack stepped beside him, placing a hand on his massive shoulder. "It's almost time, isn't it?" he whispered. Boris didn't respond, but Jack knew the wild was calling him home. Jack knew the day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. Boris had outgrown the cabin, outgrown their shared life. He was no longer the fragile cub Jack had rescued from the snow. He was a powerful grizzly, a creature of the wild, and it was time for him to return to where he belonged. One morning, Jack made a decision. He took Boris deeper into the mountains, far beyond their usual trails, into the thick of the wilderness. This would be the place where he would say goodbye. They walked together in silence, Jack savoring every step, knowing that each one was bringing him closer to a life without Boris by his side. When they reached a remote clearing near a riverbank, Jack stopped. Boris, sensing the shift in mood, turned to look at him. Jack reached out, his hands brushing against Boris's thick fur one last time. "This is where you belong," he whispered. "It's time, buddy." Boris huffed, but he didn't move. He had always followed Jack, always trusted him. Jack swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "Go on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go." Still, Boris hesitated. Jack knew what he had to do. He took a step back, then another. "You have to go, Boris. You have to live." His voice cracked on the last word. Boris let out a deep, uncertain growl, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. Then, slowly, he turned. He took a few steps away from Jack, then stopped. Jack didn't move. The pain in his chest felt unbearable, but he knew this was the only way. After what felt like an eternity, Boris took another step, then another. He paused one final time before disappearing into the dense trees, the rustling of his massive form growing quieter with each second. Jack stood there long after Boris was gone, staring at the space where his friend had been. The wilderness had taken him back, as it was always meant to. With a heavy heart, Jack turned and made the lonely trek back to his cabin. The air felt colder, the silence deeper. Life would go on, but it would never be the same. He had saved Boris, and in return, Boris had given him something he never expected, a purpose, a connection, a bond that transcended words. And though Boris was gone, Jack knew one thing for certain: he would never forget him. The days following Boris's departure were the loneliest Jack had ever known. The cabin, once filled with the sounds of Boris's playful movements, was now eerily quiet. The absence of his companion was a weight that pressed down on Jack's chest, a void that nothing seemed to fill. He had spent so much time preparing Boris for the wild, yet he had not prepared himself for the silence his absence would bring. Jack continued his patrols as usual, walking the same paths he once took with Boris by his side. But now, every rustling leaf and distant growl reminded him of what he had lost. He found himself stopping at places where Boris had once played, tracing the paw prints that remained in the earth. He had always known Boris would leave. He had wanted Boris to leave. But that didn't make it any easier. As the months passed, Jack forced himself to adjust. Winter arrived, blanketing the forest in white, and he kept to his duties, ensuring the safety of the land he had sworn to protect. But deep inside, a question lingered in his mind: was Boris safe? Had he adapted to the wild, or was he out there struggling against the harshness of nature? Then, one evening, as Jack returned from a particularly long patrol, he saw something unusual near his cabin: large footprints in the snow. Bare prints. But these were not the tracks of a stranger. Jack's breath caught as he knelt down, tracing the familiar shape in the frost. He knew those prints. He had followed them countless times before. Heart pounding, he rose to his feet and looked around. The trees stood silent, the world blanketed in twilight's fading glow. Then, from the shadows of the tree line, a massive figure emerged. Boris. Jack's throat tightened as he took in the sight of his old friend. Boris had grown even larger, his fur thick with the weight of the winter season. But more than that, he looked strong, capable. He had survived. The great bear stood there, watching Jack with those same deep, knowing eyes. And then, slowly, he took a step forward. Jack did not move, did not breathe, as Boris closed the distance between them. Then, in a moment that felt like a lifetime, Boris lowered his head and nudged Jack's shoulder gently, as he had done so many times before. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A smile, one of relief and deep emotion, spread across his face. "You made it," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Boris let out a soft huff, his massive frame radiating warmth despite the cold air around them. He lingered there for a long moment, as if reassuring Jack that he was okay, that he had found his place in the world. Then, as silently as he had come, Boris turned and retreated back into the forest, disappearing once more into the wild that had always been his home. Jack stood there, staring into the trees long after Boris had gone. The pain of their separation had not disappeared, but in its place was something else, peace. Boris had returned not because he needed Jack, but because he wanted to. And that was enough. From that night on, Jack no longer felt alone. He knew that somewhere out in the vastness of the wilderness, Boris roamed free. And though their paths might never cross again, their bond remained unbroken. Jack turned toward his cabin, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He had done right by Boris, and Boris had done right by him. No matter what came next, Jack knew one thing for certain: Boris would always be with him. Months passed since Boris's brief return, and Jack found himself settling into his old life again, though it never quite felt the same. The loneliness had dulled, but it never fully faded. He had spent years with Boris by his side, and the silence of the forest felt heavier than before. Still, he knew Boris was where he belonged, and that was enough for Jack to keep going. But the Yukon wilderness had its own way of testing those who lived within it. It was midwinter when the first signs of a brutal storm began to appear. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a bitter chill that seeped into Jack's bones. He had seen storms like this before, but something about this one felt different, stronger, more dangerous. He reinforced his cabin, gathered as much firewood as he could, and made sure he had enough supplies to last through the worst of it. The blizzard hit with a fury unlike anything he had ever experienced. Snow piled up against the cabin walls, the wind screaming through the cracks in the wood. Jack remained indoors for the first few days, keeping the fire burning and rationing his food carefully. But after nearly a week, his supplies were running dangerously low. He had no choice. He had to go out. Bundling himself up as best as he could, Jack ventured into the blinding white. The snow was nearly waist-deep, making each step a battle. He knew the nearest hunting ground was a few miles away, and if he didn't find food soon, he wouldn't last another week. But the storm had left the forest eerily silent. No tracks, no sounds of movement, just an empty, frozen wasteland. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. Jack barely had time to react before he was tumbling down a steep embankment, his body crashing through layers of ice and snow. He landed hard, pain shooting through his leg as he tried to move. Panic surged through him. He was trapped in a ravine, too deep to climb out on his own, his leg possibly broken. The wind howled overhead, carrying away any hopes of calling for help. Hours passed. The cold crept into his limbs, and exhaustion threatened to pull him under. His breath came in shallow gasps, his vision dimming. This was it, he realized. This was how it was going to end. Then, through the haze of his fading consciousness, he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl. Jack's eyes fluttered open, barely able to focus. A massive figure loomed above him, its dark shape cutting through the white of the storm. His mind barely registered what was happening before he felt something grab the collar of his coat and begin to drag him forward. Boris. The bear pulled him with surprising gentleness, his powerful frame moving effortlessly through the deep snow. Jack barely had the strength to hold on, his body too weak to fight the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. All he could do was trust Boris, just as Boris had once trusted him. The journey back to the cabin was a blur. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness, feeling the warmth of Boris's fur pressed against him as the bear continued to pull him forward. By the time they reached the cabin, Jack could barely move. Boris nudged the door open with his massive head, dragging Jack inside before stepping back into the cold, standing guard. Jack barely managed to crawl toward the fireplace, lighting the dwindling embers before collapsing onto the floor. He turned his head just in time to see Boris watching him from the doorway, his deep brown eyes filled with something Jack could only describe as concern. "You saved me," Jack whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Boris let out a low rumble, stepping closer before lying down just outside the cabin, as if he had no intention of leaving until Jack was safe. That night, Jack slept deeply for the first time in days, knowing that he was not alone. Boris had returned, not as a pet, not as a companion, but as something far greater. A protector. A guardian of the man who had once saved him. The bond between them had not been broken by time or distance, it had only grown stronger. And Jack knew, deep in his heart, that Boris would always be there when he needed him most. Jack recovered slowly over the next few weeks, his strength returning with each passing day. Boris remained nearby, watching over him like a silent guardian. Each morning, Jack would step outside to find the massive Grizzly sitting just beyond the cabin, his deep brown eyes scanning the horizon. Jack would nod in acknowledgement, and Boris would respond with a low huff, a quiet confirmation of their unspoken bond. As Jack's health improved, he began taking short walks around the perimeter of his home. Boris followed at a distance, always present, always vigilant. It was a relationship built on trust, one that defied the natural order. Jack knew that Boris could leave at any time, return fully to the wild. But he didn't. Instead, he chose to stay, at least for now. The villagers had heard rumors of Boris's return. They spoke of a massive bear seen near Jack's cabin, a creature that did not attack, did not show aggression. Instead, it stood watch, almost as if it were guarding something or someone. Word spread quickly, and soon, the tale of the man and the bear became more than just a story. It became legend. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames. He knew what was coming. The seasons were changing, and soon, Boris would have to move on. Grizzlies were creatures of the wild, meant to roam freely. Jack could never truly tame him, nor would he want to. The following morning, Jack awoke to an eerie silence. He stepped outside, searching for the familiar silhouette of his companion. But Boris was gone. There were tracks in the snow, leading toward the deeper woods. Jack followed them for a while, his heart heavy, but he knew better than to go too far. Boris had made his choice. Jack returned to his cabin, feeling the weight of solitude settle upon him once more. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't alone in spirit. He knew that somewhere out in the endless wilderness, Boris roamed free, strong and thriving. Years passed, but the legend of Jack and Boris never faded. Hunters and travelers claimed to see the great bear near Jack's cabin, watching from the trees but never approaching. Jack himself never saw Boris again. But on quiet nights, he would sit by the fire and swear he could hear a distant, familiar huff carried on the wind. A guardian of the forest. A friend, forever bonded beyond the constraints of man and beast. And so, the legend lived on. The story of Jack and Boris is one of resilience, trust, and the unbreakable bond between man and nature. In life, we all face moments of solitude, challenges that seem insurmountable, and decisions that test our hearts. But like Jack and Boris, courage and compassion can bridge any distance and create bonds that last a lifetime. If this story inspired you, remember, courage and compassion can overcome any challenge. Never underestimate the power of kindness, even in the wildest of places. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who loves heartfelt tales like this one. Together, we can spread messages of hope, resilience, and the beauty of the natural world. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.